everyone, welcome to HISD at Home TV. My name is Jamie Filipow and I'm the Director of Secondary Social Studies Curriculum and Development. Today I'm going to be taking you through a middle school social studies lesson for summer school. This lesson is for the week of June 15th, 2020. So the focus of today's lesson is going to be on the separation of powers. This should be a review for our 8th graders. So let's go ahead and get started. So we start every lesson with our learning targets. So for this lesson, notice that we have 2 learning targets. The first is I can define separation of powers. The next is I can explain how separation of powers is reflected in the U.S. Constitution and in real life. For this lesson, you guys are just going to need some paper and something to write with. So I'm going to give you guys about 15 seconds to make sure that you have those things in front of you so you can participate in this lesson. Okay, so as I said, this lesson is going to focus on separation of powers. So as you might know, separation of powers is one of the 7 principles of the U.S. government. But before we dive into the reading for this lesson and looking at the U.S. Constitution, let's make sure we understand what separation of powers is. So let's go ahead and define it. So the separation of powers can be defined as the division of the U.S. government into 3 branches that share power. So sometimes people call separation of powers the 3 branches of government, right? And notice on the right-hand side, we have an image that'll help you visualize the 3 branches of government: executive, judicial, and legislative. Okay, so we're going to start by reading about the 3 branches of government. As we read each section, I want you guys to try to answer a few questions. The first question that you're going to need to answer is what or who makes up each branch? The second is what are the duties of each branch? And then finally, why are the powers of government separated? All right, so we're going to take this branch by branch. We're going to do a reading for each branch, and we're going to go ahead and do the first one together. All right, so let's start with the legislative branch. Please follow along as I read aloud. The legislative branch is called Congress. This branch is made up of 2 houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The legislative branch has the power to make laws. They can also declare war, borrow and issue money, pay for military forces, regulate commerce or trade between states or with foreign countries, approve treaties, and impeach officials. Okay, so remember the first question we need to figure out who or what makes up this branch, right? So let's see. In the beginning of this reading, I noticed that it says the legislative branch is called Congress, right? So if I ever see that word Congress, I know that they're talking about the legislative branch. And then it said that this branch is made up of 2 houses. One is the House of Representatives, and the other is the Senate. Okay, so that takes care of my first question. Who makes up the legislative branch? The next question was what was the main power or the duties of this branch? Okay, so according to this reading, the legislative branch has the power to make laws. So I'm going to make sure that I underline that. That's the biggest power. If we're going to make a general statement about what the legislative branch can do, that's what they can do. They have the power to make laws. And then the reading goes into more detail. They can declare war, borrow and issue money, pay for military forces, etc. But the most important thing that we need to remember today is that the legislative branch, also known as Congress, has the power to make laws. All right, pretty simple. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the executive branch. I'm going to read it out loud. As I read it out loud, I want you guys at home to figure out who makes up this branch and what is the main power of this branch. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. The executive branch is led by the president and vice president. The executive branch has the power to enforce or carry out laws. The president appoints cabinet members and Supreme Court justices, negotiates treaties with foreign countries, and also signs bills into laws. The president also commands the armed forces. All right, so in this reading, go ahead and take a moment to identify who makes up the executive branch. I'm going to give you guys about 10 seconds. All right, so hopefully you guys identified that the president and the vice president make up the executive branch. And then the next thing we're looking for is the main power. What does the executive branch have the power to do? And hopefully you identified that the executive branch has the power to enforce or carry out laws. So one way to remember that is that the executive branch starts with E and enforce laws starts with E. So the executive branch enforces, both start with E. All right, let's go on to the judicial branch. I'm going to read it out loud again. Remember, you're trying to figure out who or what makes up this branch and their main power. The judicial branch is made up of the Supreme Court and all lower courts. The judicial branch interprets the laws. The judicial branch also has the power to punish lawbreakers when found guilty in court, review lower court decisions, and declare laws and executive actions unconstitutional. All right, I'm going to give you guys about 30 seconds. Try to identify who or what makes up the judicial branch and their main power. All right, if you have someone sitting next to you, go ahead and share your answer with that person, or if you're in the room by yourself, just go ahead and say your answers out loud. All right, time's up. So hopefully you guys figured out that the judicial branch is made up of the Supreme Court and all lower courts. And the main duty of the judicial branch is to interpret the laws, right? One way to think about this is the word judicial. It has the same beginning or the same root as the word judge. So the judicial branch is made up of judges that work in court. Okay, we still have one more question we need to answer, and that's why the framers of the Constitution created the separation of powers within our government, right? So we're going to read about the purpose of separation of powers, and we're going to try to find that answer. Are you ready? All right. The founders of our country divided the government into three parts or branches. Together, the three branches share the power of government. Each branch has certain duties and powers. No one branch grows too strong. No one branch grows too weak. As a result, no one person can get too much power. No group of people can get too much power either. Right. So the question is, why did the framers of the Constitution include separation of powers in the document or in our government? Take a moment and try to find the answer in this reading. Okay, so the reading begins to tell us that the founders divided it into three parts and that each part shares powers of the government. But if we look at the last two sentences, that gives us the reason. So hopefully you guys identified the end of the paragraph as the purpose of the separation of powers. No one person can get too much power, or no group of people can get too much power either, right? So the separation of powers helps keep our government in balance. All right, so now that we have defined separation of powers and we've done some reading about separation of powers, let's look at separation of powers in the US Constitution. So this is going to be a little bit trickier. Right, so when we read this primary source, when we read the US Constitution, what I want you guys to do is we're going to read it together. We're going to determine which branch of government is discussed in each part of the Constitution, and then identify how separation of powers is reflected in the part of the document. Okay, we're going to go ahead and do the first one together. All right, so this first part is from Article 1 of the US Constitution. Remember, we're trying to figure out which branch of government they're talking about and which powers are being reflected. How is separation of powers reflected in this? Okay. Are we ready? Let's go ahead and get started. Article 1, Section 2. The House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of several states. Section 3. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state. Section 8. The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, borrow money, regulate commerce, coin money, establish post offices, declare war. All right, so as I read that, that's part of the Constitution, so this is a difficult text to read through, but we can figure it out. So I saw some key words, right? I saw the term House of Representatives, and I saw the term Senate. So if I'm remembering back to what we just read, if I see those two parts, I know that those two parts make up Congress. All right, and Congress is the legislative branch. So I know Article 1 of the Constitution is talking about the legislative branch, right? So the next part, I need to figure out what powers that that Congress has based on the Constitution. And if I look at the last section, it says that Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, borrow money, regulate commerce, coin money, establish post offices, etc. Right? So these are the specific powers only for Congress or the legislative branch. In other words, those powers have been separated and given to Congress or the legislative branch. All right? Okay, let's go ahead and try the next part of the Constitution. So this is Article 2. I'm going to read it aloud and then give you guys some time to figure out which branch is being discussed and how it reflects separation of powers. All right, Section 1. The President shall hold his office during the term of 4 years and, together with the Vice President, be elected. Section 2. The President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy of the United States. All right, I'm going to give you guys about 1 minute, figure out which branch they're talking about in Article 2 of the Constitution, and try to find an example or the reflection of separation of powers in this part of the document. Take about 20 more seconds. Okay, so what did you guys find? What branch of government is Article 2 of the Constitution referring to? If you guys found the words president and vice president, then hopefully you guys remembered or figured out that Article 2 is talking about the executive branch of the Constitution. And then the next thing we were looking for is how separation of powers is reflected, or in other words, what powers or what are some of the powers given to this branch. So according to Section 2 of Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, it says the President is the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. So that's one power of the President based on the Constitution. Again, those powers are separate from the branch that was discussed in Article 1, which is the legislative branch. All right, so we have one branch left, so let's go ahead and read Article 3. This time, I'm going to let you guys read it on your own. I'm going to give you guys about 2 minutes to read this excerpt from the Constitution, try to figure out which branch is being discussed to find evidence of that, and figure out what powers are discussed for that branch. So 2 minutes starting now. One minute. About 30 seconds. All right, so let's come back together. So again, we're looking at Article 3 of the US Constitution, and your first task was to figure out which branch of government is being discussed. So there's some key words in here. So the first is the Supreme Court and inferior or lower court, right? So what branch are they talking about? The judicial branch. You guys might have also noticed the second word in section 1, judges. Remember, J-U-D is also the beginning of the word judicial, so that's another hint for you. Okay, now our job was to figure out what was one of the powers of the judicial branch based on this excerpt from the Constitution. So according to section 2 of Article 3, the judicial branch is in charge of the trial of all crimes, right? Makes sense. We're talking about courts and judges, so trials, that makes sense. Okay, so good job. You guys were able to read excerpts from the US Constitution, figure out which branches were being discussed, which powers were being discussed, and also figure out how separation of powers is shown in our government. So way to go. All right, so let's recap. We defined separation of powers. We read a secondary source about separation of powers that gave us the basics of it, who's involved, what their jobs are. And then we looked at a primary source, which is the US Constitution, to look deeper into separation of powers. So now it's up to you guys. It's time to show what you've learned about the separation of powers. So for today's lesson, you guys are going to create a metaphorical representation. We're going to create a metaphorical representation for the separation of powers. In other words, if separation of powers was a thing, what would it be? You're going to turn the abstract concept of separation of powers into a concrete image, all right? So here are some ideas that you could use for your metaphors. So you could explain the separation of powers as a football or another sports team. You could explain it as a band, maybe a tricycle, right? Tri means three, it has 3 wheels. Or you could create your own example. All right, so this could be a little bit tricky. So I'm going to go ahead and share my own example to give you guys some help. So my example was, I said that separation of powers is like a 3-ring circus, all right? And I have a picture. You guys are going to draw, but I found one online. But I said the separation of powers is like a 3-ring circus because it involves 3 parts, each with distinct roles. But they must all work together for the show to be successful. So for a successful 3-ring circus, each ring needs to do their job. For a successful government, each branch of our government needs to do their job. So do you see how they work together, how it's a metaphor? All right, so then I have my picture and then I labeled each part of the picture. So the ring in the middle, I said, was the executive branch. That's usually where the ringmaster of the circus is. I know the executive branch is where the president resides. So sometimes you might be able to consider the president like the ringmaster. And then the 2 rings on the outside, I labeled the legislative branch and the judicial branch. So they all are important. They all work together. They're all about the same size, right? They have shared powers, different powers. They're all important. And then I also labeled the audience as the US citizens, because remember, without people like you and me, without the citizens, the government wouldn't work. All right? So it's your turn. So you're going to have the next 10 minutes to create a metaphorical representation for separation of powers. And you're going to need to include the following must-haves. 1, you need to include a simple drawing of your metaphorical representation. Okay, so you can just sketch it. It doesn't need to be a masterpiece. If you are able to use technology and find a picture online, that's fine too. Once you have your picture, you need to label the parts of the drawing with the 3 branches. So there should be 3 parts, 1 labeled executive, 1 labeled judicial, 1 labeled legislative. And then you need to have a written explanation of the metaphor in complete sentences. So in other words, how does your example of a thing, whether it be a band, a sports team, a circus, a tricycle, how does that thing relate to the 3 branches of government? And then finally, your work should be neatly done and show effort. Okay? So you remember, you can use one of my examples or you could come up with your own, but you're drawing a sketch. to represent the three branches of government. All right, I'm going to give you guys about 10 minutes starting now. All right, you guys have about 6 minutes left, so hopefully you've come up with your idea and maybe you're starting to sketch your drawing. I'll give you a hint. If you're still stuck, think about the word branches. That might give you another idea of something you could draw to represent the separation of powers in our government. You've got about 3 minutes left. All right, 1 minute left. So try to put your finishing touches on it, double check your must-haves, make sure you have your drawing or your sketch complete, you've labeled all three branches, and you have an explanation of the metaphor. It should be at least 2 complete sentences. All right, guys, so we're just about out of time together. I would love to be able to see what you created to represent separation of powers. If I can't see them, please share them with someone in your household, share them with your teacher if you can. I'm sure you guys did some amazing work. Okay, so just before we leave, let's revisit our learning targets. Remember, we started with 2. So hopefully by now you can answer these 2 questions. One, can you define separation of powers? And then the second is, can you explain how separation of powers is reflected in the US Constitution in real life? So hopefully you guys can answer those 2 questions. Take a moment. If there's someone in the room next to you, share what you've learned with that person next to you. If you're in a room by yourself, try to answer these questions out loud on your own. Okay, guys, I hope that this lesson was helpful. I hope that this helped you review separation of powers that you learned about this school year. And until next time, I want to say thank you from the Secondary Social Studies Curriculum Department. Again, my name is Jamie Filipow. I'm the Director of Secondary Social Studies Curriculum and Development, and I hope everyone is having a fantastic summer school time. Bye.